who I think read it this week. So let's just start with this idea of nihilism. And if you want to know the definition, it's essentially this idea of believing in nothing. It came about in the late 19th century and is most espoused often by a writer who you may know of, Friedrich Nietzsche. So, this idea is that human beings have control and power, that human beings create the concept of God. So, another way to put it would be to say that existence precedes essence rather than essence precedes existence. You're probably familiar with that idea in philosophy, but if not, just the simple idea is human beings create the notion of God rather than there being something present before humans that creates human beings themselves. And so there's a great skepticism that goes along with nihilism, and I think it reflects the tensions in the novel. And that is this idea of, well, should we be optimistic about the idea of human progress, or maybe even an essentially good human nature? Nihilism would say no. And if we look at the story itself, I'm sure you might have been struck by the way in which it plays on and deviates from ideas of Christianity. So there's this intersection of both. And in the Christian world, of course, the idea is the good person is somebody who submits to the idea of a higher power or an authority, or adopts the idea of the meek will inherit the earth. And the way that we turn this, if you're Ruth, she'd probably say the meek will inherit the dirt and not the earth. And the idea then through Christianity, of course, that everyone's familiar with, is the idea of you achieve salvation through suffering. So suffering is redemptive. It's what creates a higher moral purpose. And the soul and the sense are not one, even though Ruth tells Father Ferguson this. So probably one of the most heretical ideas she tries to tell him is that, yeah, having sex with me is sanctioned. Don't get, caught up in the soul, experience the body. And if we think about just this kind of idea of salvation through suffering, the character that we might identify with through this idea is Mary Fisher, who indeed does go on to suffer and who does seem to have been made into a slightly better person through all the things that she endures. Instead of seeking ways out of taking care of her mother or the children that are summarily left upon her, she pretty much buckles up and endures. So there's a way in which I see Mary trying to rise to humanity as Ruth tries to relinquish her humanity. So the other kind of things that seem to be operating in the story for me are the idea of, well, what would happen if a person, let's say, and this person is Ruth, took on this whole idea of the Ubermensch, the idea of might makes right, and the hell with civilization or morality. These are just constructs to keep the weak, uh, the weak in power, and to keep those who would naturally rise to the top, from being able to obtain their rightful place. So in today's world, too, it would be probably a form of, uh, you know, libertarianism. I'll just put it that way. Anne Brand would say, I owe nothing to my brothers. Take what you can get. And that's just part of the human evolution of progress. So it's a very dark idea, but it's predicated on the notion of happiness as your guide, not the betterment of other people. And even as Marx famously said, religion is the opiate of the masses. But nihilism takes it a step further and just would give any person who is ruthless, and I say that deliberately enough, the ability to take on power. Okay, so there's that operating in a dark way in the story, and we see that Ruth, unchecked, does run amok with her power, is able to overturn every system of justice, every system of religion or morality, and even the banking system, just through her might. Now, another part that we might think about is in the story, there are both oblique and very direct references to myths and stories. And as Weldon says, myths are not true, myths just explain a need. What she means by that is that Myths reflect something darker in our human psyche, our wishes, our maybe deeper desires, the dark human impulses that we have. And fairy tales, even though we think of them as something designed for children, often have kind of dark things to say about human nature. Joan Didion puts it slightly differently, and she tells the version of it that people tell themselves stories in order to live, meaning they invent stories or maybe create these myths as ways to justify what they've done. And so some of the ones I've listed them here. I'll pick up a couple of them because they're more obvious. Pygmalion is the myth of the sculpture. And if you looked at the power presentation for this week, you'll notice that there's a really nice play on the Medusa myth. So Pygmalion is, of course, the sculpture, or she's a statue of the beautiful woman, Galatea, that is breathed into life by the gods, so that Pygmalion can now have the sculpture he's designed as his life partner. Frankenstein. Frankenstein's all over the story in lots of different ways, but Frankenstein has something in common with Ruth that we don't always think about, and that is not just the idea of being monstrous or recreating her own body in an image that she desires. Ruth is, to me, what I find in Mary Shelley, a story of the classically abandoned child. So, like the creature that Victor Frankenstein creates in Mary Shelley's novel, Ruth is left by her parents, abandoned by everyone, unloved, untaken care of, and much like the creature, Frankenstein, Ruth then wreaks havoc on all those that are close to Victor Frankenstein. So the idea is a creature who is unloved and abandoned and left to his own devices and entirely bereft of comfort turns to a destructive path. Milton's Paradise Lost. We have, of course, the famous line, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And Ruth, when she becomes a full-fledged she-devil, although she becomes this by degrees in the novel, describes that, she's taking kind of the low road, the speedy way, the speed motor road to hell, right? As opposed to, the highway to heaven. And she's just determined recklessly to get what she wants. So like Milton's Paradise Lost Satan, the idea is, well, if I can't live out my destiny, I'm going to go outside of the order of things, the so-called natural order, and be in charge of things, and that I can do better. And so Ruth is the inversion too of the devil, and saying, well, he failed because the devil was male, but as a she-devil, I can succeed where he does not. And the other part of it is, of course, the sexual way that Ruth operates in the story. So her blatant sexuality and use of that is also connected with very mythical ideas of women and sexuality. So she has powers of persuasion, and that's, after all, Satan's gift, his silver tongue, to persuade people to do things that they should not. All right, so then there is even, of course, a reference to the Little Mermaid when Ruth talks about walking on knives, and that's the pain of having her legs chopped down so she can look up to men and be shorter in stature. All right, so I'm going to move along a little more quickly, but I will say that one thing that the story could entertain is the ideas of the way the story is a critique of possibly the vagaries of the marketplace, the kind of capitalist idea in its pure form that we are all commodities, and whoever has the most money and the most fame wins out in the end. It reminds me of a bumper sticker in the 80s, and that I hope is meant to be satirical, but it went something like, he who has the most toys and dies wins. So it was sort of, unvarnished capitalism. And in what Thorstein Veblen, and he was an early 20th century writer, wrote about in his book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, was this notion of conspicuous consumption. And he went on to describe this idea of desirability and women, and that their worth was in what he described as desirability. And Ruth brings up this point very vividly that, the idea is to be desired and not to have desire yourself. So the ultimate power is that other people want you, but you don't want them, or you want love without being loved in return. So what Ruth really does here is participate in all of what are described as very, capitalism with a capital C, unchecked marketplaces, unchecked power, unchecked monopoly over things, and the use of resources just for her own betterment. All right, so the last part of the conversation I want to get to is, what is satire doing? And how's this working in She-Devil? Well, on one level, we could just simply say, this story is so absurd. It's so exaggerated. It's so over the top. So what are we as readers to make of what Ruth has done? She's certainly not a role model, but maybe she does help us to consider, well, what do we make of somebody's power to reinvent things? In what ways is Ruth reflecting a mirror back to us and saying, despite getting all the things that she should want, why is it that Ruth desires to be something trivial? That is, a woman who looks exactly like Mary Fisher, a romance novel heroine. Why can't Ruth aspire to a different image? And so if she can't remake herself into anything other than a construct of what she's been fed through what Gia Tolentino would call a version of a trick mirror, then what's the point of human agency? And are we able to rise above the narratives that have been so embedded in our lives and taught? So I think for me, this story tells us in the end, when Ruth describes herself, as this woman who she says, and I think this is important, I am a lady of 6'2" who had tucks taken in her legs, a comic turned serious. She still is the Ruth that she's tried to remake in an image. And we can't just dismiss away all of the destructiveness that has happened to everyone else. And so in some ways you could say, yeah, she restores order in a way by just being like everyone else and acting like anybody else in power. So a woman in power is no better than a man in power. Certainly one way to interpret the story. The other kind of things I'll let you look at just maybe and think about is this story just a way of doing what I've said other kind of fields of genres do, like Shakespeare play or something like The Simpsons, because I think you're all familiar with that, or even Seinfeld, where people are grotesque versions of ourselves, meaning we're not Ruth, but maybe we have qualities that make us see ourselves in Ruth. And if so, it's worth reflecting. How are we beneath the surface, when we're rooting for a character? How are we reflective of someone who has similar values? There's distancing, which is part of, I think for me, the importance of the story in that we don't find ourselves sympathetically tied to these characters. We see them as constructs, as types, rather than individuals. And then there's some other kinds of ways that there are ways that jokes operate in the story. What are we saying about our true selves through the wishes that we have? And even in this story, there's a blurring of tragedy and comedy. I mean, Mary dies, and that's a very dark part of it. And Bobo is wandering around like a dazed sort of zombie who seems like a lifeless shadow of himself. And so, yeah, what has Ruth gained by turning Bobo into a zombie in a sense, too? That's Frankensteinish as well. But by the end of it, I think we can't come up with one interpretation, which makes Weldon's story for me quite brilliant. It resists our making her into a pithy moral lesson about, if a man does you wrong, just find a way to revenge yourself. Well, we can't quite go there. It's also self-defeating because the fact that Ruth is trying to revenge herself against Bobo but gain him back really gives the man a lot of power. So in a sense, it puts Ruth right back in the construct where women cannot imagine themselves without a man in their lives. So it gives them a lot of